Yeah, Neal Spira. And I want to thank Jesse for inviting me to be here with you this evening. It's a great opportunity for me to be able to share and to think. I was thinking in advance, given the topic, colleagues and conversations, how I was going to speak with you tonight. That's in addition to what, but how. And I wanted to do it in the spirit of kind of sharing, uh, like a show and tell almost, like back in grade school. Not so much telling or speaking in any authoritative way, but trying to just share with you the way that I have played with psychoanalytic ideas and concepts to try to make sense out of my life and out of this world that has shaped my life, and out of the way that I think about my life shaping the world. And as is kind of more customary in psychoanalysis today, I want to make explicit my subjective point of view. We're living in a world of psychoanalysis that is uh, characterized by what you might call a turn to the relational, and an emphasis on two people and the dyad, and to honor that, I certainly want to convey my own perspective, which is the perspective that informs all of my thoughts. So, for one thing, I'm obviously old. I'm 73 years old. I was born into this universe in 1951, and I'm Jewish, and that is another factor that informs everything I think, and my own value system. I'm a psychiatrist, so I was kind of medically acculturated, and I think that in terms of the other thing is that I'm a psychoanalyst. That sometime in my life, probably when I was in my teens, I recognized, resonated with what I took to be psychoanalytic ideas. There was something felt, not so much that the ideas were intellectually compelling to me, as that they touched something in me very early in my life, to the degree that it shaped my professional interests and career and my sensibilities. And what in particular, when I'm talking about psychoanalysis, I'm talking about a corpus of ideas and work that has to do with what I would colloquially the unconscious, which means the things that we don't know about ourselves, the things we can't see. Somehow that captured me, probably because I recognized there were so many things I couldn't see within myself as I was growing up. And so, my life has been a process of learning more about how I know what I know and don't know, and learning how to employ that with other people. And so, what I'd like to share with you today, then again, is how I've played with these ideas to make sense of a world that is absolutely crazy. And I'm sure you can relate to that. We are all sharing the experience of times that it's hard to avoid comparisons with the worst of times. Are we on the verge of a civil war? Are we on the verge of World War III? These are horrible things to say, but I think these are things that we nonetheless feel, and I think the impact of the social surround on the way that we feel is so enormous, that I'm glad to speak with you at a time when the social surround is impacting on us to such a intense degree. And I hope that what I have to say this evening, it feels relevant in that way to the kinds of the ways that people experience the world. So tonight's topic is guilt, and the basically what I'm going to share with you about guilt is really fairly simple, and so without getting, psychoanalysis has a way of making things complicated, insanely complicated. But I think if you've only got a little time tonight and want me to cut to the chase, I'm going to convey to you what I have to say about good guilt in just a little poster that my daughter sent to me. She's a librarian in Vermont, and she came across a poster that she displays for children, and some brilliant person composed this. And I wonder if Tracy, if you could put this up. Yes, it's called "What to Do When I Make a Mistake," and you may not be able to read it, but I'll read it for you. And it's because this really has the basics of what I'm going to say when I think about good guilt. Guilt has to do with making mistakes, getting things wrong. And so the things to do: learn from it, make amends if I hurt someone else, keep things in perspective, breathe, regroup, and try again, recognize that I'm one step closer to getting it right, be honest with myself and others, talk about it with others to avoid getting stuck in shame, brainstorm ways to do things better, take responsibility for what I did, apologize, remember that I am not a mistake, forgive myself, and remind myself I am human, and that's what we as humans do. We make mistakes. Okay, that's the thrust of it. Now, this is a child's poster, and I don't know who created this, but I think it's brilliant, and I think this is the hardest thing to do. It seems so simple, but it's, in fact, as I'm sure you all know, it is insanely hard to try to do these things, and that kind of attitude is what I am talking about as good guilt. How to use guilt, the emotion of guilt, as being a motivator to do better. Now, that's as opposed to other ideas about guilt. For example, one of my supervisors likes, from my days as a trainee in psychoanalysis, likes to joke around, guilt is the mother's weapon. I don't know if that resonates with you, but the idea behind that is that guilt can also be a punishment. It can be used as a way of manipulating others, and it can be used as a way of punishing ourselves. That is not good guilt. That's what I would call bad guilt. And one of the things I hope we can come away with in as I talk on, unless we go in a different direction, is to understand that kind of punitive, harsh attitude is really a destructive thing, and that it's not really equivalent to guilt. It's a way we keep ourselves punish ourselves from taking the essence of guilt and doing something constructive with it. And yet this is what people do. The other thing is the idea that guilt can be unconscious. That is to say that it's invisible. At least this is my perspective on it. And it's not one of these things that can be proven in an empirical way. The kind of guilt I'm talking about is the kind of guilt you can't see. It's so obvious in its absence. It's mysterious, and yet it announces itself in the kind of anxiety and self-criticism that feels so habitual that people don't even recognize that what they're really dealing with is an enormous sense of guilt and anxiety. It's just sort of hiding there like a fish underwater. the title, I think, Good Guilt, is obviously an appropriation from John Lewis, and as you know, John Lewis was a congressional representative who died, I think, a couple of years ago. He had started out as a protester back probably when I was a young man in the I think it was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was a African American civil rights group, and he went from being a protester to being a representative, and he was not famous for, but he was associated with a phrase called "good trouble," and so good trouble is if his version of the. I'll give you a quote here. He said this. This was in a tweet. Don't get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day or a week or a month or a year. It's the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Well, the idea of good trouble and necessary trouble and getting in trouble has a lot to do with guilt, and the idea of rooting it in a civil rights figure brings me to where my story comes from. So I would like now to transition it a little bit and draw your attention to a time in this world that we would all like to forget, although in a few years we would like to forget this time as well. I am quite sure, but this is another time. What I'm talking about here is the pandemic. And I would like you to kind of relocate yourselves in time and remember what that was like. And I'm serious when I say this is something that nobody wants to remember. But within the space of a few days, it's as if everything changed. And for me, what the pandemic was like was that it was like a light or a lens that shined a light on the way that society was fractured in so many ways that it had not been quite as apparent beforehand. And when I think about it, it is kind of a blur. But one thing I do remember is the terrible fear that we all had of dying and of being with each other, and the anger and the questions of why, and the search for somebody to blame. That was very common, even in my patient reactions. I remember the distress of having to experience all the distress of my patients as they coped with, why did this happen, and how scared they were. And we were all kind of in this together. And so having gone from individual in-person treatment to being online, it created a unique set of circumstances where I was in a different state of mind, surely. And it was in this situation on May 25th, 2020, that I happened to see George Floyd get asphyxiated by a white policeman in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as the man was kneeling on George Floyd's neck on national TV. And I couldn't believe it. I just could not believe what I was seeing. And it may sound naive, but why couldn't I have seen this before? I'd been aware, of course, of other similar incidents. Trayvon Martin and Breonna Taylor, in Chicago, a fellow named Laquan McDonald had been shot. But watching George Floyd get murdered on TV, and I use the word murder because I had to tell myself this is what's happening there. It was like seeing a public lynching. And I just could not believe what I was seeing. And I think that it had an effect on me in the sense that probably along with many other things, I felt, oh my God, haven't we gotten further than that? And I felt like past history was right here before my eyes, just playing out. Uh, Now, having experienced this, I really felt myself to be in a dilemma because under usual circumstances, what I do is I'll turn off the TV, I'll get a cup of coffee, my mind will go somewhere else. And as I sort of dwelt here, I thought about that line in Dante, that you're probably familiar with, that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. And actually, I don't know if Dante, I think that was a paraphrase from John Kennedy, but it kept echoing for me, and but I think I began to recognize that what I had thought of as a moral crisis, I'd always thought of it as an external crisis. But here I felt I had a crisis. It was internal, and that there was a set of values that I felt I had and that I had to uphold, and that I claimed to hold that couldn't jive with watching what I was watching on TV. And that it impelled me for some kind, I felt like I was in a case of either I dismiss this and don't take it seriously, or I got to do something. And that if I didn't do something, I would be contributing to a situation that was morally reprehensible to me, just incurring more moral injury. And the other thing here, which it perhaps it was a generational thing. I alluded to my age before, and where I started out as a boomer, an aging boomer. I felt, my God, I thought we had been going in such a forward direction. And yet here I am, and here am I going to leave this world with this kind of a mess? We thought we had done such terrific things, and we've civil rights struggles in so many different areas, and we're still fighting the Civil War. And of course, there were a number of other incidences that, for me, kind of reinforced this idea that things hadn't changed. We were still with the Proud Boys and so much Charlottesville and all of that, and the idea here that the ascent of the right wing in terms of neo-Nazis and anti-Semitism. I wondered to what extent we were reliving the Civil War, or reliving or finding ourselves in the situation such as my grandparents were experiencing in years ago back in Europe, pre-Holocaust Europe. And this is saying this is how it happens. This is how things get rolling. And in fact, along those lines, one of the things we learned in the pandemic was that there had been another pandemic, and it had occurred in 1919 and 1918 after World War I, and it killed hundreds of thousands. I'd read nothing about it, really. I mean, I'd had some awareness, from learning about its sequelae as a physician in Parkinson's disease, and some of the casualties, but the sheer numbers and the experience of what it must have been like to go through this had vanished in history. And I began wondering, well, to what extent did it influence what came after, and what's replaying here? So I kind of got caught up in this idea that of history repeating itself. And certainly this is not a new idea, right? There's so many great quotes about that. The classic is these are things that are outside of the artistic in the artistic community. This seems to be something that people who are older and live long enough get themselves the opportunity to see. So there's the idea of those who forget history are bound to repeat it, but from a guy named Santayana. And the idea that Karl Marx said history repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce. And one of my favorites is, Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. So I think I'll ask you, as a group of colleagues here to think along with me, here in your own sense, how does history repeat itself? Does it? What's going on? And personally, as I got immersed in this, I thought, well, I got to do something. What am I going to do? Well, I'll write about it. So that's part of how we got here, because I wrote about it. And what I'd like to give a plug for here is the process of writing itself. That I don't know how many of you like to write, and but for those who do, I personally I would share with you that I personally have found writing to be one of the best ways of finding out what I really think about things. And so one of the biggest difficulties in writing is, which relates back again to some of the issues we're talking about in terms of self-criticism and guilt. The hardest thing about writing is censoring. And often, when you censor your thoughts, there can be some good ideas, also some bad ideas, but to allow yourself the opportunity to really become aware of what you think through the writing process, I think is a gift that you can give yourself. And I think it's a fount of creativity that I would encourage all of you to participate in if you are so inclined. So I did write this paper. And what was I going to write about? Well, what I was going to write about was I was going to take what I knew about psychoanalysis and see if it could give me any reflection, not only about guilt, but about the connection between guilt and repetition, to see if I could make any sense of it, or the best sense I could make of it as an individual, and then to think about how I might apply that to society. So I think I'd like to, well, let me pause here and see if anybody has any questions, first of all. Feel free to share with me. I may miss something on the chat, but you can send them to the chat.
And I'll monitor the chat.
And you'll monitor the chat. Okay, so if anybody, please feel free. But the methodology here, I think, is an important thing. I'm not an empiricist in the sense of doing a double-blind study, or by what authority can I tell you, or beyond conveying to you what I think I've seen with my own eyes. Now, this becomes interesting because what we see with our own eyes is often subject to distortion. We've got our take. When you see with your eyes as a kid, it's not the same as what you see as an adult. Our brains are different. Our minds are at different times are looking from different perspectives. And so one could argue certainly that the current scientific methodology, the kind of objective, double-blind empirical methodology of science is beyond doubt very valuable. On the other hand, there are things you see with your own eyes that you see. And to deny what you see with your own eyes can become the source of a lot of difficulty, and it can be defensive as well. That we know that this is, or at least I think I know that this is how people behave. That they discount what they see in such a way as they're not able to process it. That's part of what I mean by unconscious. So I'll beg your indulgence here in sharing my own observations and my observation about the mode of observation, because I think that becomes, kind of fundamental to this discussion, what we see with our own eyes. So the question I posed for myself is why can't we learn from history? And the theory that psychoanalysis provides here is that the inability to learn isn't because we're stupid, and it's not for lack of wanting to learn. But one reason we can't learn is because, let's say, there are unconscious factors that interfere with our knowing what we know. And here's a case study for you that I think has had ripples. It's the story of Oedipus. And Oedipus Rex is the story of a man who's the king of his city-state, and he's found himself in COVID-19, Theban version. He's in a plague, just like I was, just like we were. And it's the story of his waking up to his own moral complicity in bringing about the plague that afflicted the community. So in his efforts to try to figure out, his public health epidemiological efforts to figure out what's caused the plague, he learns that the plague has been sent by the gods as a punishment for his own murderous transgression. It is his pursuit of the criminal leads him to himself guilty. And so what does he do? He blinds himself as an act of self-punishment. Bad guilt. Okay, so that is what I think a Freudian model for what I would call bad guilt. And I'm going to talk a little bit now, about Freud and repetition. The Oedipus blinded himself, and is a way of not only punishing himself, but not being able to see something. And the conception that Freud had of things that you don't want to see or acknowledge was that he thought about it in terms of things you don't want to remember, that these were things that defied memory. And his idea about things that you don't want to remember was that you buried them, and deep out of your awareness, they became hidden. But very early on, he got to the idea that they didn't remain buried; they were repeated. And so that as a poor alternative, as an alternative for a failed process of repression, of burial, individuals would repeat the same things over and over again. And of course, in your patients, this is something that the way we conceptualize, a lot of what we see in patients, that they come in complaining of one thing or another. And at a certain point, one starts to think, how are you creating this situation? What is it in you that keeps getting you into the same trouble again and again? It's not fate. There's something that is coming from you that you're not aware of. We call it character in the psychoanalytic world. And so this was the Freudian motif. One way of not knowing was to bury it. Now, one of the contributions, that Freud made was that he turned our attention to various elements of the internal workings of the mind. And I also want to make a bit of a sales pitch here. I recently edited a book that's going to be coming out it's called it's called the International Journal of Controversial Discussions, and it's published by a fellow named Arnold Richards, who's a analyst, and this particular volume has to do with what we keep and what we throw out from Freud. And I started out talking about the relational bent in psychoanalysis, but what I want to affirm here is the deep value of the intrapsychic contribution of Freud, and to urge you not to throw that out. Because to my mind, this is one of the great contributions of psychoanalysis. And Freud did a lot of thinking about why we bury things, why we do it, that I think has a relevance today. And of course, one of the crucial elements in his thinking about what it was we were burying has to do with guilt. In 1923, Freud came up with this, what we call the structural model of the mind. And I'm sure you may be aware of it, but this is the model that includes what he called the id, that for Freud was, the seat of our impulses. And there was the ego, and that was our rational thinking. And then there was something that he thought was, perhaps the most important of all, the superego. And the superego was, in a way, it was the conscience, but for Freud, it was the harsh part of the conscience, the unconscious tendency to go after ourselves and to punish ourselves and to hurt ourselves, that he thought was embedded in us, and that contributed to a lot of sickness. And that according to Freudian theory, late Freudian theory, the reason that we buried stuff was we wanted to keep ourselves from knowing things about ourselves that was going to get us in trouble with our own punitive superego, our harsh conscience. So we wouldn't blind ourselves or hurt ourselves or attack ourselves. Much of the time, the patients following this line of thought, one can think of many of the problems that our patients have as failures in their system to operate. Evidence of self-punishment, anxieties, afflictions of one sort or another that indicate according to this point of view, a tendency towards attacking the self. And so what did Freud try to do with this? Well, at that point, he was big on telling people what was in their unconscious. And so he would try to convey this to people. People would come in with suffering from one thing or another, and he'd finally get to the point in his treatment that he would convey that people were essentially making themselves miserable out of being too harsh on themselves, try to demonstrate it in their lives. And then for a certain number of people, they'd just get sick again. They'd go nowhere with it. That no matter what he could do, let's see if I can find his quote here. He's referring to a certain group of people that he fails in the treatment with. And he says, there's no doubt that there's something in these people that sets itself against their recovery and dreads its approach as though it were a danger. We are accustomed to say that the need for illness has got the upper hand in them over the desire for health. And if we analyze this resistance in the usual way, then even after we've subtracted from it the defiant attitude towards the physician and the advantage of illness, the greater part of it is still left over, and it reveals itself as the most powerful of all obstacles to recovery. more powerful, the assumption of a negative attitude toward the physician or a cling to the advantage. I'm sorry. In the end, we come to see that what we are dealing with or clinging to is called a moral factor, a sense of guilt, which is finding atonement in the illness and is refusing to give up the penalty of suffering. That's the Freudian concept of what he called a negative therapeutic reaction. That when you try to convey to somebody that their illness is a sign of guilt or point out to them how guilty they are, they just stay sick and keep punishing themselves. Now, I can't sell you on this, that's a idea that I think has been questioned a lot of the time, and yet I think that the idea of people not turning away from insight and not being able to use insight, even in their own self-destructiveness, is something that has a certain amount of weight to it. But of course, at that time, Freud didn't really understand guilt in its fullness, and future analysts, in particular, Melanie Klein and Donald Winnicott, began to understand more about how complicated guilt was. And so, as you may be aware, the idea of guilt as a normal stage that a child goes through, it became something that caught on in the form of what Melanie Klein called the depressive position. And the basic idea had to do with the fact that a young child or young infant can't help at a certain point but have aggressive impulses towards the person, the mother that the child is connected to. And that in the infant's mind, the prospect of being aggressive towards the object that they depend on is filled with danger. Because if indeed they harm that person, they're going to destroy everything that they depend on, and so the young child is left with the dilemma of what to do with their own destructive impulses, and therefore they come up with immature solutions like splitting, and I don't want to get into the whole Kleinian corpus of theory, but the basic idea is that the idea of how one learns to hate and love the same person, or to hate the person that you love, is an enormous difficulty for the youngster, what they call the pre-Oedipal child, and that if things go sort of right, a person learns that the hatred does not destroy the positives in the relationship, and that overall a child is left with what we call the capacity for ambivalence, and that the idea of regretting and having empathy for one's hurtful impulses, inevitable hurtful impulses toward another, is just something we have to carry with in life, and that's called the depressive position. So further down the line, a fellow named Winnicott began to think more about this. And what Winnicott came up with was that, well, it's very difficult for somebody to achieve that position, for a child to achieve that position, unless they've already contributed to the mother, unless they have felt that they've been able to give something to the mother, to give something good to the mother, to contribute to the mother in such a way that when their difficult impulses come out, they can feel secure in the knowledge that they've got some credit in the bank, that they're not going to destroy somebody, and that this becomes there's a certain amount of altruism that needs to be accepted in people in order for them to manage guilt successfully, and that if played right, guilt, it can be an important emotion, and it's an inevitable emotion in life. You just can't get away from it. And so that's sort of where I want to go with it, because where Winnicott comes out is not so much that guilt is the impulse side of guilt, but that guilt is a feeling that is hard to bear. And it's dangerous to bear, and that part of the reason that we get away from guilt is because it's an affect that we would rather not have, and so we bury it. And that's one thing we do with it. Another thing we do with guilt is that if things become too unbearable, we try to avoid it by the paranoid mechanisms that Klein described. We instead of saying, I did it, I apologize, you did it. You did it to me. It's not my fault, it's your fault. Blaming others, splitting. And you're the bad person. Projective identification, all the kind of primitive mechanisms of creating a paranoid and hostile world. I want to shift to just one clinical application of this in a way, and go back to the pandemic for a minute. During the pandemic, as I sat there listening to my patients talk about their torments, I had many patients who would talk incessantly about how the world had ended, or fear of how the world had ended, or fear that the government was fucking them around in every conceivable way, taking everything away from them and out to harm them in ways that they could not stop talking about. And it seemed to me in excess, and not even as a political, I mean, I agree to some degree sometimes with these things, but I found myself listening to a barrage of this that seemed as if it had to be coming from somewhere else. And in at least a few of these cases, the patients that it became apparent to me, number one, that these patients were, first of all, when they were talking about the anxiety and the punishment and the difficulties that the pandemic had brought forth, they were talking like Oedipus in a way, that they for one reason or another had reasons to feel terribly guilty, and they were experiencing the pandemic as a punishment for this, except they were blaming the greater society for aspects of themselves that they could not quite tolerate, and the idea that they themselves felt guilty was something that was not so obvious. And I tried, when I caught on to this, I was able to more easily separate what was the reality of the pandemic from what were some of the internal issues that people were facing at that time. And I don't know if others had experiences like that, but I want to kind of bring that up, as a way of kind of indicating just how the avoidance of guilt. People will go to various lengths to do that. And so I want also to talk about, in addition to repression, I want to talk for a minute about the other great way of not knowing. And this is something that Heinz Kohut brought to us, and his colleague Michael Bosch. The idea of disavowal, that another equally good defense is just what I was trying to describe earlier, that it's got nothing to do with it. It doesn't have any meaning. I can see this guy die in front of me. It doesn't mean anything. It's TV, and it's not real, because to the degree that you let it in, that you take it seriously, you've got dissonance. You're compelled to act. And so it's much easier not to. So what I'm trying to convey here, not so elegantly, is that uh, we have various ways of avoiding guilt. This is really what I came to. That guilt is often invisible and will go to any length to avoid it, and that as individuals we have enormous ways of disavowing guilt, which comes back to haunt us. And I began to think about how to apply this to society at large. If there's any way that, that this could be in some way what's happening politically and socially in our world over time. Now, I want to give a plug here also. There's if what I'm saying is too oblique, it's very well articulated, as I discovered, by a Canadian psychoanalyst named Donald Carveth. And Carveth was the former president of the Toronto Psychoanalytic Association. I think he's a sociologist by training, but he's done a tremendous amount of work and videos and YouTubes about the idea of guilt as the basis for not only much suffering in this world, but guilt avoidance as being the base, guilt avoidance being the basis for more suffering. And that his position, as is mine, is that if people could hold on to that feeling for a little bit, perhaps instead of beating oneself up about it, one could try to take it and do better. Because after all, if when you're confronted with a moral gap, it does put the burden on you to do something. And the question is, will you take it up? Now, my position is that for many of the patients I've seen, and including myself, that once one becomes aware of the degree that one is suffering because one is not, or is afraid one is going to get punished for their moral transgressions, one has the opportunity to try to do some kind of repair. And to try to find ways to do that feels good. And I think in a way, I think that a healthier relationship with guilt is something that is really fundamental to our individual mental health. So now let me pause for a minute here and before I go into the social realm.
Well, so just answer your last comment. How would you understand then the different kinds of protests that emerged from this sort of moral dilemma of seeing George Floyd, or the moral dilemma in Palestine right now, where some people do take action on their guilt and try and take political action, but then some people take action on it in a more destructive fashion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, look, thank you. That is really yes. I think all I can say to that is yes. I wrote a blog on this actually months ago. So talking about Israel Palestine, for example. One of my greatest fears when after the October 7th attack was that it was going to become an opportunity to unleash all the hostility that was built up on both sides in a unbridled manner without any kind of restraint. And so I think that the tendency to destroy is so much of a part of us, and to blame the other, to project one's own worst impulses onto the other, is such a temptation. Another association I have to that is Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which is the story of this angry crazed man who wants to go after the evil whale. He has put all his his worst impulses into this white whale that he's going to kill. It's a project. So I guess you could think about it, or I would think about a lot of it as projective identification in Kleinian terms, surely. But in terms of trying to recognize, to come to some sort of truth and reconciliation, to try to find a space for truth and reconciliation, I think this is the hardest thing for us to do. And personally, in terms of my own uh, struggle with it, what I found a real dilemma is that uh, to speak out on behalf of Palestinian justice, for example, to the degree that I felt that they had been treated unjustly, was made impossible by feeling like I was participating in my own lynching of myself. The idea of being identified as a Jew and being hated in that way. It's how I felt, at least. It made it very hard for me to align myself with whatever rational kinds of social to find a social space in which I felt that I could join with others without getting caught up in these kinds of malignant processes. So the to I can't how I think an easier place to approach it is individually. I know when I'm beating myself up, and I know when I'm feeling like beating somebody else up defensively, I think. But I think the idea of recognizing I suppose where this takes us in a way is to Jewish ethics in a way. And again, this is where I come from. So I don't assume anybody else is necessarily coming from this position. But one of the good things about the Jewish religion is at its best, and this is one thing that makes me sick thinking about it, is that the holiday of Yom Kippur is the wisest creation psychologically that I can think of in terms of the relationship of an individual to his society. And of course, what Yom Kippur does, it invites us to examine our transgressions and to return. There's a concept called teshuvah, which is a cleansing, a letting go, and the opportunity to do better. That is, I think, the highest thing for individuals, and of course for society. The question is, why can't societies do it? So back to George Floyd again. This I think is what I was thinking, and it relates to this idea of repetitions for me. I was born in 1951. In 1956, in 1951, Eisenhower, it was right at the juncture between Joe McCarthy and Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower becomes president in 1952, the D-Day, the champion of D-Day, who led us to the world that we boomers got to inhabit, and which was with the longest peacetime, luckiest generation. We were the luckiest generation. 1956, Brown versus the Board of Education. 1960, the hopes and promises of John Kennedy. But then 1963, the Kennedy assassination. 1960, Martin Luther King, and then the Martin Luther King assassination. But Obama, in a way, it felt like a progression. And yet there had been all these blips to me what seemed like blips along the way, until my George Floyd moment, and I think the moment we're at now, when I feel like I've become much more aware, post-Trump, of all these malignant forces that have been out there, And so, yeah, how does one account for the fact that there seem to be these moments of enlightenment or progressivism, and the clock gets turned back so dramatically? And surely guilt can't account for. I'm not saying that guilt can account for everything, but my sense of it is that there must be some degree to which people cannot bear the truth of what they have done to other people. Otherwise, people who have consciences and who in their day-to-day dealings are decent, uh, well-intentioned people who cannot allow themselves to recognize the harm they are doing to others, lest they would feel terrible, and therefore they are drawn to polarization and to paranoia and to the best defense is a good offense, right? So I guess the concept would be behind that. Is there guilt hiding, and is that a tenable thought? And of course, what would one do about it? What does one do with it in any event? So that's as best as I can muster in response to what you're asking me. And but I want to turn a little bit now, to this idea, of to amplify. If we good, what could good guilt do? What do we? All right, let's say we want a more just society. Where do we go with that? And I think here too, this is drawing from another paper I wrote. That psychoanalytic ideas can allow us to play with all kinds of things, and governance is another one. So, the we're confronted here, as Americans, with this idea that who we are isn't who we think we are, who we want to think we are. And our country was founded, was aspirational. It was founded as an idea. And the idea was based on certain kinds of Enlightenment principles of human rights and liberty, and a kind of at a time when there were various ideas about human nature that were being contested. And one of those ideas was that people, to some extent, were capable of governing themselves, and that by having some degree of self-government, we'd be able to have a country where people would be allowed the pursuit of happiness. So another question I would ask is, what is the pursuit of happiness? That as analysts, we've learned a lot about human nature. And so, can we employ what we think we know about human nature to think about governance in a way that gets us away from some of these polarized kinds of concepts that really don't seem serviceable? And so some of the things I think about, in terms of what we've learned from analysis, is that, a good society is a society that's going to take into account not only people's material needs for safety and to some degree of freedom, but also human psychological needs. And we do have needs. Psychoanalysis and psychology have come up with a whole inventory of things that people seem to require. And among them, certainly, in addition to the need to love, which is something that Freud really was talking about when he was talking about libido and appropriate vehicles to deal with their aggressions, like the Bears or sports. There's our narcissistic needs, our needs to be understood, and our needs to have ideals, our needs for ideals. That the need to have people in our country, leaders we can look up to, is a very, very important thing psychologically. We should be able to deliver that. I think that the health of many of our young people it has suffered from growing up in a world without ideals. And then what we've learned recently from some of our neuropsychoanalysts, Mark Solms and Jack Panksepp, about the need for exploration they've come up with a whole set of uh, uh, mammalian needs that seem to be part of our animal nature, the needs for nurturance, the needs to be attached to somebody, the needs to take care of somebody, the need to play. All of these kinds of things are things that are more illuminated now. And I think that there's a question as to whether we can create governance systems or measure our governance systems by the degree to which these kinds of needs are fulfilled. I find that to be an interesting idea to play with. And then, finally, I think one of the really important things is that I think this relates to the trajectory of life in a way that I think as a youngster, as an adolescent, one is much more sensitive looking at the world through adolescent eyes to the hypocrisies of our elders and the contradictions between what they say and what they do. And some of the injustices we're talking about. Certainly our young people are very, very aware of that. I think it's got a lot to do with the protests that have been taking place. They're well-intentioned. They're about the seeming immorality of our world that they're at the precipice of. And I think what happens is as you become an adult, in order for us to meet our own life needs, we become participants in the status quo. And in a lot of ways, what the status quo is the system that implicates us in the very processes that are so upsetting to us, where the long-term derivatives are all the malfeasances and all the hypocrisies that if we keep on protesting them, we're never going to make a living. Or we martyr ourselves, or that sort of thing. So I think the best we can do is to do better at being able to manage that to where we put the status quo, how we move the status quo, in such a way as not to invite a counter reaction and to acknowledge our hypocrisies and to try to manage them in a way that is honest and that can allow us to do better. And I think I've run out of steam in terms of what I've got to say initially. So
you've said a lot.
Yeah, I have said a lot. Yeah.
Which is much appreciated. So I wonder if what reactions or questions people might have. So we're getting a couple people saying they need to leave. For those who are here, I mean, again, I find this so compelling. One thing that I think about, that we think about here at Yellowbrick, because we deal with Gen Z, emerging adults,
Right.
is how they have been thrust into this world of intense moral dilemmas in a way that, I don't know, in a degree to which we didn't have them. It's everywhere around them, no matter where they turn.
Yeah.
There are these, moral dilemmas or dilemmas that really challenge how we're going to manage our guilt or our shame.
I believe it.
Hi, Neal.
Hey, Jesse.
Thank you for your comments, which I find both deep and broad. And I really appreciate you resurrecting guilt as still alive and more well than we are, and making us unwell.
Yeah.
So, because I think it operates at all levels of psychopathology,
Yeah.
and actually is potentially lethal in the more deeply troubled people.
Yeah.
Some comments for yours and perhaps others' reflection and response. So you asked the question, who created that child poster? Well, everything on that poster is in the Talmud. I'm Jewish too. And was actually codified by Maimonides, who was a rabbi and physician in the 1100s, in terms of how to do repentance. And the only thing that's not in that poster that was in the code was to also make an active commitment to make a different choice next time. And to actually do exposure response prevention, to put yourself in the same circumstance and make a different choice. While you mentioned Yom Kippur, actually for Orthodox Jews, in your 3-time-a-day prayers, you actually do prayers of repentance. And I think that the ancient wisdom is really affirming what you're bringing to our attention, that guilt is really toxic and it is really stubborn to try and modify and transform within ourselves, that it takes repetition of acknowledging, and facing who we really are and speaking about it and making, commitments to move differently. And the other part of the wisdom is you're supposed to say that within relationships.
Yeah.
And well, let me say first that you say it in relationships, and there are two relationships. One is you say it in a relationship, a community of other imperfect humans, and you say it in a relationship with the Creator. And the assumption there is that they're going to respond in the kind of acceptance, compassion, attunement. We're all in this together. Spirit that's in that poster. And a fundamental principle in Judaism, why it offers these kinds of processes, is that there's a basic principle there's always the possibility of change and hope and redemption and a different way of being in the world, and exercising the gift and privilege of creation. I think what I see in our troubled patients is that, you mentioned the word teshuva. Teshuva is usually translated as repentance, but it actually in Hebrew means return.
Return, yeah.
And so return to whom? Return to a better self, but return to others. And I think what our patients who are deeply troubled by guilt and shame, but we're talking about guilt at the moment, is that their experience in their early attachments was that when they did something either perceived or actually wrong, were criticized, were punished, they didn't have the path of return. They also had a loss of the needed relationship at the very time that they were being, guilt-induced. And I think that's what we're up against, because there was no path of return for many of these patients that we work with. So those are my comments. Thank you again.
Oh, I really appreciate those. That not only the rooting it in Judaism, which makes me feel like less of like I'm going out on a limb, in terms of talking about something that's personally meaningful and beautiful to me. And I'm glad to see you echo that. And it's tragic to me also, though, at the same time, to see what's happening. But also, the uh, the it makes me wonder how our parenting has to what an extent the kinds of parental or family experiences your patients have are shaped by the times as well. I know it's been for years. I started out working with, I know you've been working with young people for years. When I started out years ago working with adolescents myself, and I'm not sure what I thought I was doing at the time, it's interesting to hear your perspective as an adult in terms of the kinds of things people are dealing with, and the kind of empathy I think one is capable of. I think for me it comes with maturity. To be able to recognize some of what it hasn't been given in other people, to see past the defensiveness that some of our youngsters bring to us, or to get beyond issues of control with them. It is a hard time of life. It's hard to be young in this world, I think.
Michael Buchanan has a question. I don't know, Michael, if you want to speak it, or I could read it.
Would you mind reading it? I've got some technical difficulties. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So Michael asks, I recall that Carveth has an idea of conscience as the positive counterpart of the superego, and that Freud made a mistake to set aside the idea of the ego ideal early in his career and focus instead on the superego's negative moral authority.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought he asked you to comment on that.
I think it's exactly right. That's how I understand what he is saying. Is also he is looking at the way that I think Carveth looks at it is that guilt has to do with that what Freud ended up identifying as the major part of the superego was the punitive aspect, and that self-punish, at least according to Carveth, and kind of line I'm giving here, that the self-punishment itself is really a maladaptive symptom. That it's as much of an avoidance as anything. If you're just busy, how many times do you see patients coming in and saying to them, oh, I'm just a hopeless jerk, and just beating up on themselves and not returning in the sense that Jesse's talking about it. That it's as if beating up on themselves it constitutes some sort of expiation, when in fact it's just a narcissistic kind of self-torment that keeps them from the appreciation. Geez, I really have hurt somebody else. It's conscience. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be like that. I can be better than that, because I think what Carveth is suggesting is that conscience gives more room for a object-related kind of experience. That conscience has to do, and the kind of guilt experience he's talking about has to do with the way we damage others. And that and that conscience would have been a preferred term to illuminate that kind of an experience, rather than confine it to a kind of what I think he looks at as the malignant process of self-injury, of self-attack. That he believes is defensive itself. It's an avoidance, just among other avoidances. And that the real painful thing, the real hard thing, is to say to myself, I've injured you. Can I live with that and still be a decent person and or a better person? And I think that Carveth sees conscience as being untarnished, with the kind of self flagellating impulse and a way of talking about good guilt. I think, in a sense. I think it's the same idea that he's trying to convey, that it's there's an opportunity to stop kvetching and go about trying to repair, in a sense. And I think that is so. If being around a depressed person or a self-absorbed person or a person who's beating themselves up, you really get the idea that it's not a reparative thing. They're not making good use of their guilt. They're just, it's. I suppose if you're dealing with in an impulse control model or in some sort of an energy model, you're thinking, well, you're discharging it onto yourself, but and therefore you're doing something economically with the badness. But I think that he sees it as a moral dilemma, Carveth, as do I, and I think it's the moral dilemma that's the source of difficulty in individuals and socially. But I would encourage you to watch Carveth's videos. There's a lot of them. He's eloquent about it. He's very, very good. And the most important point, back to what Jesse was saying earlier, there is I think what I'm suggesting here softly, I'm very dismayed about the movement away from guilt in our psychoanalytic theorizing. That the movement away from the internal experience and the conversation one needs to have with oneself is a potential real loss for psychoanalysis. Analysis permits a certain. I used to think of psychoanalysis as a branch of Judaism in a certain sense. It's got such roots there, but in the sense that it reflects the struggle, the struggle within oneself. And I think that there's a real difficulty once that kind of perspective is avoided. And why things are moving in that direction, I'm not exactly sure, but I do think that even for psychoanalysts, I think this is another Carveth position. It's hard for us to face. It's hard for us to hold in our minds against great pressures otherwise. And so it's not an easy business, but that's the thing with the unconscious. These things are so present. You don't even they're hard to see. And so I hope that I've sparked some interest in keeping it in vision tonight.
What I find really compelling about the Yom Kippur process in asking for forgiveness, it's not only for what we have done, but it's also an admission that we know we're going to fuck up in the future. So please forgive us for when we fail.
Right. Because there's no excuse for not trying. Right.
And I'll just again add the attachment, please. Please stay with us.
Yeah.
Knowing we will fail.
Oh, wow.
And Freud's original concept, of, really psychotic guilt, had to do with the inability to maintain the attachment, in grief.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Please.
Can you hear me or?
Yes.
I'm not always sure. I'm Adrienne Harris, and I've really, really thought this was a very moving conversation. And I found myself thinking a lot about the 60s and about the Vietnam era and about anti-war protest, and at the same time, the complexity of sort of military violence and the war and the kind of, I just think these questions, I thought about your talk mostly in terms of the politics around feminism and various kinds of activisms. And I think it's just incredibly important about how much guilt is actually necessary and has to be part of the fuel and the monitoring of what to do. But I found myself thinking a lot also about Vietnam and just what people did and not just, I'm not talking about soldiers, I'm talking about anti-war and the sort of violence of that and the
Yeah.
things being out of control. And so I just think you've given us a lot to think about, not just in psychoanalysis, but I think a lot in the political sphere that we're all struggling in.
Yeah, well, thank you. For me, it just analysis happens to be my way of putting it together. I think there's the religious way of putting it together, but I think we're always trying to put it together. That's it seems to be a part of human nature is trying to figure things out. And I think wherever you sit, things always it looks so different at different parts of life. But the uh, the uh, to to recognize, I think to on the one hand, there is something fascinating about seeing how things manage to take their course. There's a novel, 100 Years of Solitude, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, that sort of goes after the idea of the cyclical nature of things. And I think that once one becomes aware of how it operates, the tendency, I think, is to become overwhelmed. And I think that is really where, at least for myself, I feel that's when you want to stay involved, stay connected. And I think I hope as older people that is one of the things that we can contribute to the younger generation. And working in Yellowbrick, I think that outside of the form, this is the language of mental health. If we were all living in a Native American tribe, and we have the young people and the older people, and I think the idea of trying to use the wisdom that exists to try to help our younger ones along, despite the damage that we have done to them as we were in the middle generation, I think is a very important social function. Yeah, we'll see what we do going forward. But we've got our work cut out for us in the next couple of months, that's for sure. And
longer than that.
the longer, yes. Well, ain't that the truth? It's scary, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
It is. Yeah.
One of the things I found myself doing with my son, who's 28, I think, is helping him see that it is worth your investment. It's not,
Exactly.
Things are a real mess and who knows what's going to happen, but it is worth your investment.
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates for me too with my kids. We're a little older, but for sure.
Well, this has been very compelling. And as I think I've communicated to you in the past, I found your paper on the Arc of the More universe really helpful to me in trying to frame this for myself and my own way of trying to relate to all this. So I appreciate your sharing your wisdom with us and enlightening us today.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity, and it's been a pleasure, and it's helped me to think things through myself. So thank you very much. It sounds like you're doing wonderful work, and I wish you all the best. And I hope we can make a positive contribution to this world going forward. Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you
so much.
Take care.